just launch the first question here. And I'll just give everyone about 60 seconds to respond. Okay, it looks like responses are starting to taper off here, so I'm going to end a little bit early. I hope people can see the results here, but it looks like we have a nice diverse audience with us today. So thank you so much for answering that first question. Okay, I'm now going to pass it over to Daniel and Rob to begin the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emily. Go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you. Hopefully you should be able to see my full screen at this point. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be speaking a bit about regulatory policies for e-cigarette flavors, and then I'm going to pass it over to Rob afterwards to speak on some policy options that are still under consideration for e-cigarette flavors. So there's really been an increasing attention to the role of flavors in the dramatic increases seen in Canada and other countries in e-cigarette use by young non-smokers. And at this point, we have pretty good evidence that the use of flavors in e-cigarettes is pretty directly associated with youth uptake, and that's been shown by the World Health Organization. A number of studies have found that fruit, sweets, and beverage flavors are significantly increasing the chances of 14 to 17-year-old teenagers choosing e-cigarettes. They're more favored by youth than adults as well, and that these fruity flavors are often seen as less harmful than standard tobacco flavors, especially to young people. With that said, though, these are often categorized into a few sections, like fruity, mint, dessert. There are thousands of flavors available, and all types of fruity, sweet, and drink flavored liquids as well. So hopefully experience from policy restricting flavors in combustible cigarettes and other tobacco products should provide us some important teachings for developing e-cigarette flavor regulatory policies themselves. There's been a lot of work done to try to regulate combustible tobacco flavors. The 2010 WHO Framework Convention recommended restrictions or bans on flavors in tobacco products, and many jurisdictions have banned flavored combustible cigarettes, often excluding menthol, including the United States, the EU, Australia, Brazil, and Canada. And the FDA in the USA was given authority to regulate flavors in tobacco as a whole. So we have this framework, we have these set precedents for one, the damage that flavored tobacco can do, and two, the policy frameworks and the regulatory frameworks that we have used in the past to quite effectively limit and often ban flavors in combustibles. So I'm going to speak on a few, the EU, the United States, and Canada. I'll make a small plug that our report covers a lot more than just these three jurisdictions, but I'm going to be speaking on flavor regulations in these three areas. But I also want to note that the WHO recommends countries to apply bans on flavoring of e-cigarettes to deter use by youth. So the precedent and the recommendation is already out there, regardless of what countries are actually taking up. So the EU Tobacco Products Directive does not require member states to regulate e-cigarette flavors. Its preamble notes that regulating flavors could be useful and the prohibitions would require justification. But in 2016, Finland did ban e-cigarette flavors in both nicotine and non-nicotine e-liquids, and a number of countries, including Estonia and Denmark, have tabled legislation to ban e-flavors. But it's also worth noting that this contrasts with the EU Tobacco Products Directive as a whole, specifically around combustibles, which has said that these should be, with regular combustibles, tobacco products should be restricted in terms of flavors. So some of this is just about catching up with many of the recommendations that have already been made by the EU to apply those more towards e-cigarettes. So in the United States, in early 2020, the Food and Drug Administration did release its enforcement policy aimed at unauthorized flavored cartridge-based e-cigarettes that appeal to youth, including fruit and mint flavors. And this is an enforcement policy, not an actual ban. And it's aimed at fruit, candy, mint, and dessert flavors from small cartridge-based e-cigarettes. So that's a lot of qualifications. It doesn't apply to menthol and tobacco flavors and does not apply to large tank-based vaping devices. And those are both quite popular. And also because it's an enforcement policy, not a ban, companies that violate that policy by continuing to manufacture may be at risk of FDA enforcement actions, but that is often at the discretion of the FDA. And as we will discuss, a lot of this comes back to sort of political elements. There was increasing pressure to take on some of those regulations, and then allegedly or apparently some of these restrictions had pushback from supporters of the current administration, and they had to factor that in. With that said, over 260 localities in the United States have prohibited the sale of flavored e-cigarettes, including large cities like Boston and San Francisco. But as we'll see with Canada and more broadly, online sales can obviously cross city and state lines. So meaning the citywide bans often don't really get at the bigger issues and leave real gaps. So in Canada, federal legislation bans the promotion or labeling of confectionery, dessert, cannabis, soft drink, and energy drink flavors, but not the actual flavors themselves. So it's illegal to advertise these vaping product flavors, and there's more and more conversation about flavor restrictions. But right now, at least nationally, the focus has been on advertising these flavors. That is similar, just as a side note, to New Zealand, except New Zealand has taken on a more comprehensive approach. But so in New Zealand, they've done a bit more of the actual banning of the flavors, but then they've also banned certain labels and certain language that is known to appeal to youth. So certainly there was talk of these flavors that were called gummy bear, or things that were clearly made to appeal to kids' interests that were banned. And the idea here is that Canada is trying to take that on as well. But provincially, there have been a number of moves forward. In Nova Scotia, the government announced regulations to ban the sale of flavored vaping products, and that's been effective since April 1st, 2020, and that was the first in Canada. PEI has established a regulatory authority to restrict flavors on e-cigarettes. In BC, it's moving forward with a series of measures to reduce youth vaping that include a banning of sales of flavored e-cigarettes, except in adult-only premises. So we'll talk a bit about this later as well, but that has been a sort of middle ground that some jurisdictions have taken, where there's a overall ban where versus a often general store ban or convenience store ban, where it's mostly restricted just to adult-only premises or vape-only shops. And that's what we've seen in Ontario as well. So in Ontario, the provincial government released draft regulations to require that most flavored e-cigarettes only be sold in specialty vape shops and not convenience stores. And that's been effective now since July 1st, 2020. But e-cigarettes with tobacco, mint, and menthol flavors are still able to be sold at stores other than specialty vape stores. So that right now, often there's this delineation between fruit and candy and tobacco, mint, and menthol. And there's a push now between tobacco, mint, and menthol, whether to start excluding tobacco from the mint and menthol with the fruit and other flavors. So each province has sort of taken on its own approach, and they're finding increasingly different strategies. You can see that the sort of minor restrictions, as we categorize it, were more BC and Ontario. The more major restrictions have been largely in the US, and then the comprehensive restrictions you can see are within the US, Nova Scotia, and EU states as well. So within this context, I also want to bring up some data that's come out on flavors that's pretty hot off the press, done by Cynthia Callard, who's the Executive Director of Physicians for Smoke-Free Canada, on flavors themselves. Because I think the context of what people are doing should be, in terms of flavors, should be actually informing the way we see policy. So you can see here the differences between interest in the fruit flavors from the different age groups. The younger age groups, 15, 19, 20, and 24, significantly prefer fruit over the older age groups. Whereas if you look at tobacco, the preferences for that are largely in the 25 plus. That's that 21% versus 3% for 20 to 24, and only 9% for 15 to 19. So when we're thinking through this kind of data, and this report will be available, should inform some of how we're talking about what bans to apply, because there's this idea that, you know, that banning fruit will really hurt adult vapors, and you can see some adult vapors do use fruit flavors, but really that it's largely in the other group. And then you can see that the tobacco flavors really go the other way. As well, so this is the main reason for vaping among never smokers. And you can see the #1 reason, both in 2019 and in 2020, for vaping for never smokers is the flavors. So we want to consider this when we're thinking about what those flavors really are appealing to. Are they appealing to people who are trying to quit, or appealing to people who who have never smoked, don't want to smoke, and are just taking up vaping but wouldn't be smoking otherwise? Now, this one we'll have to talk about, but in terms of what best describes the main reasons that people vape, flavors themselves are not often the #1 factor. If people are vaping, for former smokers and regular vapors, it's often to help them quit smoking. So I think that we'll want to think about this narrative of flavors as required to get, you know, that people will only vape if there are flavors. I think some of the data is starting to push back at that a little bit. So to follow up on all of that, there really is a scarcity of research on e-cigarette flavor restrictions, and assessments of their likely effects on decreasing e-cigarette use by young non-smokers must rely for now on extrapolating from restrictions on flavors in cigarettes largely. With that said, Juul reported no loss in sales after eliminated all flavors except tobacco and menthol. And after a small loss in sale, after they decided to withdraw most flavored products from stores, their sales recovered within weeks and surpassed the maximum. But as well, a lot of other companies took up the non-menthol flavored market since Juul abandoned it, signaling a need for more comprehensive industry-wide regulation. So even though Juul voluntarily did this, if we're just expecting companies to start taking on their own flavor restrictions, it's been very clear that other companies will just fill that gap. Overall, the Juul flavor ban had mixed results. 5 months after Juul, this is from Tak et al. Study, only 28% of Juul users signaled that the flavor restrictions had affected their use. And then of these, 46% stopped using Juul, but 27% changed their purchasing behavior to either obtain pods online or to use non-Juul brand pods. 25% had switched to mint or tobacco flavor. So these are important to keep to understand, but also to think through for future restrictions. The online marketplace, when we're thinking about how we want to regulate, it needs to be considered. A lot of restrictions up to now have focused on the convenience stores and general stores, the adult-only stores, and those are important, but a lot of, especially young people, know how to just find these flavors online. So that's a future location for research. So I'll leave you with this table of major policy options that we can talk about, and I'm going to give this over to Rob. So he's going to start to talk a little bit about some options and the strengths and weaknesses of each of them.
Great, thank you, Daniel. Okay, and I see that you have stopped your share, and I'm going to start my share, except that the host has disabled my participant screen sharing. Well, we'll try it again. Let's see. Sonia, are you there?
Try now.
Okay, yeah, let's try it again. Thanks, Sonia. One sec. Share screen. There we go. Okay, thank you. If I can get the slideshow here going, it'll be even better. Okay, there we go. Thank you, Daniel. So some of you were probably on the webinar last month, and you saw these first couple of slides, but I can't, it's hard for me to speak to this topic without just bringing this back in. The challenge that we have in e-cigarette regulation is that many non-smokers, young people, are uptaking e-cigarette use and becoming dependent on nicotine with potential long-term effects of both dependence and other health harms. Dependence in itself is enough to be concerned about. At the same time, we don't have conclusive evidence, but certainly there are a proportion of smokers who are successfully quitting cigarette smoking altogether and switching to vaping. And if there's an opportunity to actually move smokers off of combustible cigarettes and move them to vaping, we would likely be, almost certainly, but very likely be better off, but not if at the same time we are recruiting new people to nicotine dependence and the other harms of e-cigarette use. And you know, this is the one data slide that I'm going to show. The exponential increase in the proportion of young people who are vaping from 9% in 2014-15 until up to 29% in 2018-19. These are students in grades 10 to 12 from CS TADS, a representative survey that's been in place in Canada for many years. Past 30-day use, 29%, and 40% of those say that they use daily or almost daily. This is a sure sign that they are at least either dependent already or quite likely on their way to becoming dependent on the nicotine in e-cigarettes. So what does flavor have to do with this? Well, Daniel's already presented the information that demonstrates that flavors are a major reason why young people use e-cigarettes. He's also alluded to the fact that adults who are trying to quit smoking by vaping like flavors. So it's complicated. It's really not easy to choose a policy option that is going to get us a good balance here. What we do know for sure is that if we didn't have flavored e-cigarettes, young people would not be picking them up hardly at all. Okay, it's pretty clear from focus group work, from the recent public opinion research that Danielle showed part of, that the kids vape because of flavors. They wouldn't pick it up just to get tobacco flavor. So here we have our, we went through in our report several policy options from A to G here, you know, from banning all flavors, including menthol, to banning flavors excluding menthol, banning flavors with additional exceptions, with i.e. ban flavors except for fruit and menthol. Then D is sort of the enforcement policy in the United States, which we can argue if it makes any sense at all. Ban flavors only in closed systems, allow them in open tank systems. E is the option that is currently in place in Ontario, and I understand British Columbia is moving in this direction as well, to restrict flavors to adult-only stores. F is something that hasn't been mentioned until now. If the reason for flavors is to help the adult smokers quit, why not allow flavors only in medicinal products that are available to smokers only? And the last option would be to allow all flavors. On the x-axis up on the top are the 4 criteria by which we evaluated or we assessed each of these policy options. We look at the effects, at the technical feasibility, political viability, and finally, we want to know, could this be done by Canada or a Canadian jurisdiction without a complaint being launched successfully about our international trade obligations? And so I'm not going to take you through, that one shouldn't be there, sorry. I'm not going to take you through all of the policy options. I've chosen 3 to go through. The first one I chose is, okay, why don't we try banning all flavors except for mint and menthol? You know, this is in place in several jurisdictions and is actually quite a popular one. What might be good about this? Well, if we assess the effects, it's true that this may decrease some of the pull of flavored e-cigarettes for youth. However, I was paying attention to the slide that Daniel presented, and this is from the Health Canada's public opinion research. It said that 28% of kids aged 15 to 19 are currently using mint and menthol. 28%. So if we banned everything except mint and menthol, experience would show, and we don't have really great data on this, but it's quite likely that many youth who currently use fruit or candy or some other flavor would actually move over and use mint and menthol, because mint and menthol are attractive flavors for young people. At the same time, what would happen if we, for smokers? A lot of the smokers who vape like flavors, they like fruit, but I think that they could make do with mint and menthol as well. So the overall effect of banning everything except mint and menthol probably is that you're not going to reach your policy objectives very well. The smokers might continue to be able to vape to quit using mint and menthol, but the youth are not likely to be very much discouraged from picking up vaping, because mint and menthol will be likely quite attractive to them. I use likely because we don't have the substantial real world hard evidence about this. You know, as new bans are coming into effect in different jurisdictions, we'll be able to collect this. Can you actually enforce, sorry, that happened, I didn't move it, somebody else move it? Let's go back. Can we actually enforce a ban, such a ban? We don't know for sure, and it's going to be interesting to see what's going to happen in the illicit market. And as Daniel alluded to, if you can't get it in a regular store, you can probably still get it online. Can we enforce these kinds of things? I'm leaving that as an open question. Political viability, there is a lot of public support for banning flavors in e-cigarettes. The industry obviously is opposed. And I don't think that we would have a problem with the international trade obligations, because you're not banning the altogether. You're still keeping mint and menthol flavor, so that's still available. I can't say for sure, but it seems unlikely. Second policy option. What if we restrict flavors to adult stores only, to vape shops? Right? The argument in favor of doing this is that, well, kids can't go in there. They can't get their e-cigarettes there. Well, but is that true? Okay, so you know, what would be the effectiveness of a restricting flavors only to adult stores? Well, it would certainly decrease the visibility and the access for young people. So it could be that this would decrease youth uptake somewhat. However, we have seen that you know, the data from Health Canada and other sources that have done test shopping in vape shops indicate that a lot of vape shops are selling to young people. We also know that young people get most of their e-cigarettes from social sources. So it seems unlikely that it's going to have a huge effect on decreasing the uptake of e-cigarette flavors by youth. By simply, again, I'm saying unlikely because we don't have the real world evidence yet. This is sort of a forecast based on the best possible evidence that we could find. Another potential problem with restricting flavors to adult stores only is that for smokers, you're leaving combustible cigarettes even more accessible than you are e-cigarettes with flavors. And if a smoker would only use an e-cigarette with a flavor, it's going to be harder for them to get that than it is for them to get cigarettes. So this is a potential problem. Again, the illicit market and enforcement are potentially challenging. Political viability, Ontario passed it. I haven't heard any great opposition from it. The vape shop industry is pleased. Convenience stores unhappy, but I understand British Columbia is on the way. So this is interesting. And this could be challenged by international trade obligations. I'm not certain. Yeah, we've been talking for a long time, and we want to leave some time because we're going to have some questions now for our panelists who can weigh in on these things. I'm just showing once again that the purpose of our presentation is to demonstrate that there is a range of policy options. We don't have great evidence on the effectiveness of each of these options. I've talked about a few of them. Important as in each of your jurisdictions, you're having these discussions about what should the province or the territory do, to think about the whole range of options and not just focus on one of them. And I am going to leave it at that. And thank you for your time, and hand it back over to Emily, who's going to moderate the Q&A for our panelists. If I stop sharing, stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Rob and Daniel. Before moving to our questions for the panelists, we'd like to do another quick polling question with the audience. I'm just going to launch our second question. If you could push for one new flavor policy option, which would you choose? Prohibit all flavors except tobacco everywhere. Allow all flavors, but only in vape shops. Prohibit all flavors except tobacco, menthol, and mint. Or lastly, allow flavors to be sold only to smokers. So I'll just give about 30 seconds this time. That seemed to be about enough.
Okay, Emily, I'm seeing the results come across my screen. Are you seeing them as well?
I am.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay, so polling seems to be slowing down here. I'll share the results. So the first option seems to be by far the most popular, prohibit all flavors except tobacco everywhere. So thank you so much for participating. Very interesting. Now, just before jumping over to our questions for the panelists, I'd like to remind everyone that you can type your questions into the chat. We'll be reserving the last 20 minutes or so for questions from participants, so please feel free to type your questions in there, as some are already doing. Now, moving to our first question for the panelists. How effective do you think it will be to restrict the sale of flavored e-cigarettes to adult-only vape shops? Flory, if we could start with you, followed by Heidi and Les, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. So firstly, thank you for allowing me and inviting me to be a part of this initiative. I don't think it would be very effective. One, vape shop owners don't have a real good track record of not selling to minors and just being very responsible in their retailing. Already, Health Canada enforcement activities have shown that they didn't follow the very few restrictions that were put in place, whether it's just banning some of the confectionery and marijuana flavors as part of the S5, the federal legislation. So no, in short, I don't think it would be very effective. And I think it speaks to some of the issues that were raised in the presentation earlier, and that when you have a very partial ban, whether it's a ban on specific flavors or specific outlets or specific manufacturers, that you don't cover the whole market, as is the case with Juul in the United States, people will find their products elsewhere. And in the context of vape shops being pretty prevalent now across Canada, it'll be quite easy for the youth who are simply buying their products in convenience stores currently, to just switch to vape shops. And so yeah, I don't think it would be a very effective measure.
Thank you so much, Flory. Heidi.
Yeah, I'll just add that there's, you know, the notion that if you restrict certain products to adult-only vape shops, that would somehow improve the situation is quite, I mean, it's pretty popular. It's you know, a lot of people will think about that as a potential solution, but we tend to forget when vape shops started illegally, but they were tolerated by Health Canada in between 2016 and 2018. Their compliance with not selling to minors was much worse than regular convenience stores, was up to 20%, while other convenience stores had a 7.5% non-compliance rate in terms of selling to minors. And as Flory said, Health Canada did a huge wave, over 3,000 inspections in 2019 amongst both vape shops, specialty vape shops, and retailers. And in terms of non-compliance, for a variety of measures, including what flavors they're allowed to sell, and whether or not they're allowed to do testimonials. I mean, that's banned, or whether or not they did testimonials. 85% of specialty vape shops were non-compliant, compared to 15% of convenience stores. We can't, there's absolutely no reason to trust more specialty shops versus convenience stores in terms of respecting the laws to protect youth. And so this notion that that it's, you know, better to restrict whether it's flavors or whatever else to specialty shops is, you know, goes counter to the data. That's it.
Thank you very much, Heidi. I'll pass it to Les now.
Thanks, Emily. Hey, I noticed on the poll, we've got about above 60% who believe in a full flavor ban everywhere. And that's consistent with what we've seen in polling across Canada, including a leisure poll that Heidi and Flory conducted earlier this year. And that's about as much support as we ever had for banning menthol in cigarettes. And we got menthol out of cigarettes. So we can get menthol and other flavors out of vaping products as well. To the question, yeah, it's terrible policy to reward highly non-compliant vape shops with the exclusive right to sell kitty-flavored vaping products. Based on the track record of vape shops and Health Canada's own enforcement effort, I don't think they deserve the right the exclusive right to sell flavored popsicles, never mind flavored nicotine products. We need to clamp down on vape shops and get them complying. You know, Nova Scotia has banned all vaping products. They're still having problems with vape shops selling flavored vaping products, rampant non-compliance, and hopefully they'll clamp down on that soon. But it's a terrible situation. Regarding Ontario's policy, I think Ontario got it wrong on both counts, which is rewarding non-compliant vape shops, but also allowing everyone to sell some flavored products, including menthol products, when the evidence is telling us that menthol is one of the most popular flavors among kids. So we've got a long way to go on this issue. Fortunately, we've got a couple of great examples, and that's Nova Scotia and PEI. And then in the US, more recently, California, New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, I believe. So there's reason to be optimistic, but we definitely can't leave any loopholes when it comes to flavored vaping products that appeal to kids. Having said that, Ash is fine with allowing the tobacco flavor in vaping products to help encourage smokers to switch.
Thank you so much, Les. Rob and Daniel, would you like to respond to any of those comments?
I think we're best off moving on to the next question so we can have a chance to go to the chat as well.
Okay, perfect. So I'll go to the second question for the panelists. With and without COVID, what is or would have been the political appetite for adopting any of the policy options that we have presented? If you could choose for one to push for, what would it be? And Les, we'll start with you this time, please.
Well, I would push for comprehensive restrictions, just like we have comprehensive marketing restrictions on tobacco. We've got a great experience with tobacco. We've been highly successful with a comprehensive approach to reducing tobacco use in Canada. So we really don't have to look any further. Having said that, you know, omitting some of these marketing efforts by the industry, like flavored products and altering nicotine and special nicotine formulations to make these products more addictive, we can't leave any loopholes. And in most provinces across Canada and federally, we have Swiss cheese legislation. And this is some sort of great experiment that's coming at the cost of kids. You know, we've got 400,000 kids vaping in Canada. That's exactly 400,000 too many. How many will it take? Will it take 1 million before we close all these loopholes and learn some lessons from tobacco? This is really frustrating. Our chief medical health officers have been very clear on this. They've got all kinds of profile and influence. And if some of them are on this webinar, I hope they use that to get the federal and provincial governments to act, because the recommendations are there and they're solid. So let's take a lesson from tobacco. Let's not waffle. And let's turn this Swiss cheese legislation and this patchwork we have into something meaningful.
Thank you, Les. I'll pass it to Flory now.
So I agree with Les for all the reasons that he mentioned, but I do think that intuitively, I think politicians would not go for that comprehensive approach, and in part because the industry is actively lobbying for these partial restrictions. And I think it's really, so whether it be of like continue, you know, allowing for vape shops to sell flavors as the current regulations stand both in BC and in Ontario. And yeah, so the industry, it's not in the industry's interest for a comprehensive ban. And you know, in the context of most vapors in Canada being dual users at this point, it's, I mean, it just speaks to the fact that, you know, having or allowing for some flavors just increases the curiosity factors behind this product, offers the industry all kinds of marketing opportunities and just encouraging consumption and overconsumption. I mean, vaping manufacturers, the large vaping manufacturers have these programs where, and rebates where they are encouraging people to like buy bundles. So like five kinds of flavors at a time, etc. And so, yeah, I think we'll have, as advocates, we'll have to work very hard to get these comprehensive bans, because intuitively, I think that politicians might very well, you know, go to these huge Swiss cheese approaches.
Thank you, Flory. Heidi?
I'll just add it. I mean, we have to name the problem is that there is no political will to prioritize the public's interest in the whole vaping issue. From the get-go, the law was way too permissive. Health Canada or the government of Canada trusted the industry way too much and allowed unfettered marketing and allowed this problem to get to the point where it's today. These products were legalized in May of 2018. It's been 2.5 years, and already back in May, you know, soon after, already there were indications that the youth vaping problem was there and was growing, and you know, it just kept getting worse, and the data showed it. And yet we're here 2.5 years later, and what has the government done to react to this? There's, you know, we have some regulations on promotion which are clearly insufficient. I mean, they're already still just focus on youth vaping. I mean, it is an improvement, but for example, these new regulations will allow videos in bars to promote vaping products amongst young people that are not necessarily smokers. So they're still allowing the industry to recruit amongst young adult non-smokers, which why would we do that? The health effects are more and more obvious. And nothing's been done about flavors, which is the main reason why youth vape. And nothing's been done about the nicotine level, which is the main reason why they keep vaping. And so, I just have to comment on how terrible this whole thing has been handled by the federal government, and that's why many provinces now need to step in with provincial legislation. I mean, it would be great if the federal government. It's not like there hasn't been a lot of pressure and mobilization on the pressure on the federal government, but it's too little, too late. We're not going to give up and have to keep pushing the federal government, but in the meantime, it's the provinces that seem to be stepping in, and a number of them have already legislated to ban flavors and to cap nicotine at 20 milligrams per milliliter.
Thank you, Heidi. Rob and/or Daniel, would you like to respond?
I think that the panelists have covered it very well. I'm wondering, Emily, I know that you've got another question there for the panelists, but there's quite a lot of discussion in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the main themes that's coming up is about laws about youth possession.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of questions about why don't we do this? And I would pose that question to our panelists as well. And Daniel, feel free to jump in. About whether Canadian jurisdictions should consider youth possession laws. What do we know about them, and would that be effective? And what would the politicians be thinking about it?
Well, here we can take another lesson from tobacco. We know that youth possession laws don't work because you're putting the emphasis on the young addicts. You're not putting the emphasis on the predatory marketers who are supplying these products to kids and putting them on the market. So in Alberta, we had a private members bill about 20 years ago that was passed that prohibited possession. We opposed it because we knew it wouldn't work, and guess what? It didn't.
I completely agree. I think we should be largely focusing on upstream approaches. It's also criminal. I don't know, like, what does that go on the record? Is that a fine, which they either don't pay or has a big impact? I think those generally miss the point. I understand they're well intentioned. They are trying to get at the thing we all are trying to get at, but they're essentially products of the system, and we're sort of punishing the disease. We're punishing the end result rather than the structures that led to them.
Okay, Rob, shall we move to the question and answer period now, or?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Okay, I'll start with one of the first questions that came through, and I'll ask Rob to help direct this question out to our panelists and presenters. Are we overthinking flavors? Why not ban all flavors except tobacco?
So I think the panelists have largely addressed that question. The consensus seems to be that the government lacks the political will to do this. Our advocates are very supportive, I think, of an overall comprehensive ban. I think that, one question, a related question to that is the illicit market, which has come up in the chat quite a bit also. And I'm wondering if Heidi, Flory, Les, you might want to address, well, maybe we shouldn't, maybe we shouldn't have a comprehensive ban, because then we're just going to fan up a big illicit market, given that there's so much use of flavors out there. Flory, do you want to start?
Yeah, so the idea of the contraband market is something that's always risen whenever we've put forward different measures, and including when we banned flavors in tobacco products, whether it was those little cigarellos, etc. And I mean, the evidence shows that while you can have a parallel market, um, what really happens is that people change their consumption habits. What happens on the legal market has a huge impact in consumer behavior. The menthol ban for cigarettes was shown that, you know, it increased quit attempts for menthol smokers. And I mean, you can still access menthol products on the contraband market. You know, if people want them, they can still do and hassle and do those things. But it, you know, and the other thing is that if we were always just focusing on the contraband market, we would do nothing. And so the idea is, like, you have to fight contraband and you need comprehensive anti-contraband measures. I think Quebec has done quite well on those, but you still need to go forward and put restraints and new regulations on the legal market. And so contraband cannot be the issue that's always raised not to go forward. And I think it's even more important to have that comprehensive ban. When we speak of the comprehensive ban of flavors for e-liquids, we are speaking to allowing for tobacco flavors. And but it's even more important to have that comprehensive ban regarding all the other flavors, because that is a factor that increases government's ability to intercept and intervene on the contraband market. When you're still allowing for some areas of the market to penetrate, for those flavored products to penetrate the market, whether it's through online, legally online, or through vape shops, then you are making it harder and more susceptible for contraband markets to find their way onto young people.
Thank you, Flory. Would anyone else like to respond to that question?
I
agree with Flory. I agree with Flory. We heard the same things about, the same argument about banning menthol in cigarettes, and we haven't seen much of an illegal market forming.
I just want to add that when it was brought up early in the presentations that even if we talk about prohibition, if the vaping industries decide to certify their devices as cessation products, like nicotine patches or nicotine gum, they would be able to flavor them. There could be, you know, because those certified nicotine replacement therapies are allowed to have flavors. They're even allowed to be advertised as therapeutic products. But there is always a way for the industry to have flavors for smokers who want to quit if they go through that route. So it's not, a prohibition is never a total prohibition, because if they wanted to, they could put on the market certified cessation, you know, e-cigarettes, like currently in Australia are doing that. E-cigarettes are available under prescription only. And that was the goal, right? We can debate whether or not e-cigarettes are effective for cessation. There's a lot of data on both sides and many issues that could be discussed. But if smokers want to use them to completely switch from smoking to vaping, it should be available to them, and we support that. And if flavors are an important component of cessation, well, then let these products be cessation products, and they would be allowed to be flavored.
Thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, I just want to add, you also can, I mean, a lot of the problem is often that, and we've heard this in some of our interviews, that youth know where to get flavors that they can afterwards add them into the e-cigarettes. But there are ways to build e-cigarettes so they're much more closed, so that they're much less modifiable. So even within that illicit market, there are ways to discourage that. Because it is true, if you're buying off the illicit market, those flavors, they're not regulated. There are problems. But you can sort of circumvent that problem by pushing the ones that aren't as modifiable. I also think in the chat, there's a basic question. Like, I think substance policy broadly, it feels like is moving more towards system level approaches rather than individually targeted. I think that's the sort of tension that's happening in the chat right now. So just to sort of discern what's going on in there, I think that's what's happening.
Okay, Emily, I mean, unless you want to, I was going to pick out 3 points from the chat.
Please, go ahead.
Okay, and I think I'll pull out these 3 and ask the panelists plus Danielle just to pay attention and jot down which ones you'd like to address. We'll do one last round, if that's okay. One thing that's come up is a question, and Danielle, you might want to address this question. Are youth vaping rates any different where flavors have been banned or where there have been partial flavor bans? That's one question. The second is, what might be the role of municipalities in moving e-cigarette regulatory policy forward? Interesting question. And the third, and I apologize to people because the chat keeps going over and over, it keeps going down. I can't keep track of it all. The third one is what about sort of a social marketing, a bottom-up approach, educating people that e-cigarettes just are not so good for you? Wouldn't that work? Those are 3, and I'm going to open it up. Daniel, do you want to start with the first question about, do we have any evidence about the effects of flavor bans on rates of youth vaping?
Yeah, no, I haven't seen a lot on it. I think the data's missing. A lot of it's been on, there haven't been good analyses after the policy, because the policy has to be in for, let's say, a year, and then you have to do the study, and then, so most of these things, hopefully in the next year or 2 will come up. But I think that's part of the problem. And then you would also want to distinguish between policies and actual implementation / enforcement of the policies. So whenever that study is done, if someone on this is doing that, I think that will be an important distinction, because what might be the problem is not in the ineffectiveness of the policy, but the ineffectiveness of the actual implementation.
Okay, and who wants to address the role of municipalities?
I would say that in the same way that Flory explained how a Swiss cheese law would undermine the effectiveness of the measure, a patchwork of laws with different laws in different municipalities would probably have the same effect. It has to be across the province, or ideally across the country, that flavors are banned to the general public.
I agree with Heidi, but I agree with Heidi, but municipalities should be moving on vaping. All levels of government should be moving on vaping, just like they're all moving on COVID-19. We have a youth vaping epidemic in Canada, and we're counting on our policymakers to help solve this problem. And Laura Lee Marin had some great recommendations in chat that municipalities can play a very significant role, including licensing the sale, enforcing, because a lot of them have police departments or work with the local police to establish enforcement priorities, retailer education. There's a number of things municipalities can do, but this should not be a replacement or substitute for provincial and federal action. It should be an add-on, an addition.
I just want to add to that. Yeah, I think, sometimes you have to start somewhere. And so, clearly municipalities have their role to play. But I think that in the context of vaping products, or the online sale of vaping products being quite prevalent, and being a strategy that's the focus of the large manufacturers, and we saw that actually even become more or intensify in the context of COVID with JTI and Logic and VUs or Vipe for Imperial Tobacco. I think it plays into the challenges that we face and why it's so important that the bans be operated at the manufacturer level and change the market, as opposed to just where the products can be sold.
And so, I mean, what I'm hearing is doing just one thing, like, yeah, work at the municipal level, but that's not going to solve the problem. Work at all levels, work particularly on the industry, and that'll make a difference. What about the idea of like social marketing campaigns and like a bottom-up approach, trying to persuade youngsters that this isn't a good thing to do? Is there a role for that too?
So the World Health Organization has a list of high-impact policy measures, a policy package called Empower. And Empower does include mass media. It is an evidence-based strategy to help prevent tobacco use. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be embarking upon evidence-based mass media campaigns as an add-on to effective and meaningful policy measures.
And I would add that contrary to some stance that Health Canada has taken in the past to say, in the face of this huge stealth marketing by the vaping industry, Health Canada would have youth campaigns to discourage vaping. There is no competition between the power of pro-vaping marketing versus these public education campaigns on the dangers of vaping for youth. It doesn't compare. One is glamorous, one is you know, they know what they're doing, and to counter that with health, like we know that doesn't work for tobacco. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. It just shouldn't be a substitute to banning all marketing, because that's the industry knows what they're doing, and we can't compete with the same tools. It's just not doable. And so it's, you know, there should be efforts done, but it is not a solution.
Right. Okay. There is another issue coming up here about, somebody's suggesting, Flory Doucas is suggesting that asking the question, you know, since the #1 litter collected in Canadian shorelines is cigarette butts, are we seeing a decrease in that? And are we seeing cartridges and pods showing up in the litter? I can address that a little bit. I actually put in a research proposal with a colleague from the School of Engineering to try and look at the overall environmental impact of both cigarettes and e-cigarettes. And certainly one of the concerns is that the e-cigarette pods are not a good thing for the environment. And certainly the devices themselves have all kinds of things in them that we wouldn't want to have released into the environment, including the batteries are a major problem. I see there's one hand up, but we're going to ask people just to post their questions in the chat, just so that we can keep track of it that way. If you don't mind just putting your hand down and typing your question out, that would be appreciated. Emily or anybody else, are you noticing any questions that we haven't addressed at this point?
Yeah, I see one question here. Could companies who manufacture NRT offer more flavors as competition?
I can take a first stab at that one. And the idea there, for sure they can. There's nothing prohibiting them from doing so. But the idea with the whole certification process is that you do need to show evidence as to the efficacy and the fact that you're trying to control undesirable effects for medicinal products. And so that has those manufacturers focused on delivering the most effective and safest products at the lowest cost possible. And you know, the problem that we're currently facing is that for the non-certified products, for the vaping liquids that we find at the retail and in the retails and convenience stores and vape shops, because manufacturers are not being focused to look and to develop on these safest and most effective products, you're seeing those, you know, 7,000 flavors, and some of which have inherently are quite problematic in terms of their carcinogenic effects, etc. And so really, if we did go to this change of the paradigm, where the only products in the recreational market were tobacco flavors, then you would be stimulating the industry to develop other flavors to put on the medicinal market, whether that's regardless of who would be putting them, whether that's pharmaceutical companies or tobacco companies. But actually right now, there's just no financial incentive to do that.
But there's nothing stopping manufacturers right now of nicotine vaping products from bringing them under the Food and Drug Act and bringing them into the market as therapeutic products. But they're not interested in doing that because there's too many barriers versus the recreational market where there are very few barriers.
Thank you. Unless anyone would like to jump in there, we have another theme emerging from the questions. We've spoken a lot about lack of political will to regulate flavors and more broadly youth vaping, and people are wondering, why is there no political will to impose limitations on vaping? And is there any investigative journalism or unearthing of what might be going on there?
So we don't know because we are not in the back rooms with the decision makers. But I can tell you that early on, I think it was in, I can't remember what year, but early on, a representative of our group met in the Prime Minister's office under the Conservatives, and with a bunch of health groups to discuss the vaping issue. And I mean, this is just an indication, but at the top level, political level, all the questions from the political staff were about jobs and the economic benefits for the vaping industry. The vaping industry is the tobacco industry in many ways. The tobacco industry funds the vaping, the Vaping Industry Association. I don't recall the name. And so these are big players who have deep pockets, who know how the system works, who have lobbyists, and so on. And so I would answer that it's the same reason why it's taken 50 years to get comprehensive tobacco control legislation, because there are very well-funded interests who want to sell more vaping products, and public health is underfunded, advocacy is underfunded, and we're outgunned in terms of our political clout on this issue, like health advocates are probably on many other issues.
Emily, I think it's more than just a lack of political will. And we have seen governments moving on this issue during the pandemic here. We've had 4 or 5 provincial governments move. So there is some degree of political will, but there's also, I think that's overshadowed by bad decision making. And that they are making bad decisions. And part of that is certainly driven by the fact that there is a very powerful lobby on the other side of this, which is largely controlled by the tobacco industry, as Heidi pointed out.
Let me pose the question like this. What role do you think, if at all, does the government's belief that e-cigarettes are helping smokers play in their unwillingness to move further and faster on the e-cigarette vials?
Well, I think it's a factor for sure.
I will say, I know that the harm reduction initiatives, the quote harm reduction initiatives that the tobacco companies have put out are being seen widely. And we are early on in our ability to show the downsides. And I mean, we're doing some research on the other side of it. But I think for the sort of a lay policymaker, the hard data to show isn't quite there yet because it's so nascent. So the claims being made, it seems like the claims are equal by industry and public health, even though we're trying to sort of show the other side. Often it's been harder to actually, you know, there's this idea of like, it's a both sides issue where each has a say. And that unto itself is a problem. Like there's a market side and there's a public health side. We have to play a trade-off. Whereas we're trying to say the market side really doesn't have as much value here.
Great, we're just about at time, but does anyone else have a short comment on this topic?
If I could add, I think one of the fundamental problems is that early on, when the dangers of vaping were not well known, I think, you know, the federal government has a goal of reducing smoking to, oh my God, what was it? 15%.
Less than 5 by 2035.
Right. And so to reach that goal, and so what's clear is that that goal only concerns combustible cigarettes, and that the idea of switching smoking to vaping was one of the ways to reach that goal. And so there was very little concern about the effects of vaping. It was all about reducing smoking, and all the you know, and there was too much faith put into what the industry was saying, that it's easy to switch, that it's good, you know, that it's healthier or less that it's harm reduction. I mean, we can't go down the list now of all the issues that came up since then that now we, you know, that maybe would have changed those decisions in the beginning. But I think that explains part of the focus on promoting vaping as much as possible, because that would help achieve the goal of reducing smoking to 5% by 2035.
Thank you, Heidi. We are just about at time, but I want to thank everyone for attending today and making the chat so active and creating a really interesting discussion. Many thanks to our presenters for your very informative and lively responses, and to our presenters, Rob and Daniel. We really hope everyone will consider joining us again on November 2nd for the last phase of the 3-part webinar series. We will be discussing regulatory policies for e-cigarette marketing, and you can register for the webinar on OTRU's website under events. And that's all for now. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thanks all.